Okay, so you've been asking us about this increase in global conflicts we're seeing in 2025, and specifically how they might, connect to Bible prophecies.
Yeah, questions about Jesus' warnings, Gog and Magog, and even the India-Pakistan situation.
Exactly. So our deep dive today is really focused on exploring those possible connections. We'll look at the relevant Bible passages, unpack the different ways people interpret them, and offer a theological angle on these specific conflicts you mentioned.
And we've got sources covering quite a range of views, so it should be interesting. Let's start maybe with Jesus' own warnings. Matthew 24, Mark 13, Luke 21.
Right, the Olivet Discourse. He was asked about the temple's destruction, his return, the end of the age, and he talked about wars and rumors of war.
He did, and the very first thing he warned about was deception. Watch out that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name. That's kind of the starting point.
Yeah, that's crucial. Then he says, okay, you'll hear about wars, maybe even be near them, but don't freak out. These things have to happen, but the end isn't right there yet.
Exactly. He mentions nation against nation, kingdom against kingdom, famines, earthquakes, but calls them the beginning of sorrows. Just the beginning.
So what's the main interpretative split there? How do people take that today?
Well, it's sort of twofold. Some definitely see the sheer increase in frequency or intensity of these things as, direct signs the end is approaching.
Like more wars now means we're closer.
Right. But others argue, look, wars, famines, earthquakes. These have happened throughout history. They're characteristic of the age, perhaps, but not specific timetable markers. And Jesus himself said, do not be alarmed.
Which implies it's not necessarily immediate.
Precisely. And theologically, there were different takes, too. Some think it was primarily about Jerusalem's destruction back in 70 A.D. Others see a kind of dual fulfillment applying then and now before Christ's second coming.
And dispensationalists sometimes see Matthew 24.414 covering this whole period between the two comings.
All right. Exactly. So yes, rising global conflict aligns with the type of thing Jesus warned about, but saying these specific conflicts are the final signs, that's where it gets uncertain.
Okay, that makes sense. Let's pivot then to Gog and Magog. Ezekiel 38 and 39, that's a big one people bring up. A future leader, Gog leading a coalition against Israel.
That's the one. Gog from the land of Magog, described as the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. These are generally thought to be regions north of Israel. Think potentially areas in modern Turkey, maybe parts of Russia.
And the alliance is pretty specific, too.
It is. Persia, that's clearly Iran. Then Cush, often linked to Ethiopia or Sudan, but usually Libya or North Africa. Gomer, Togarmah, and it mentions many peoples with him.
And the attack happens when Israel is, living securely? That part always sparks debate.
It really does. Dwelling securely in unwalled villages without bars or gates. How that fits modern Israel is, a major point of discussion. The motive given is plunder, wanting to seize spoil.
But God steps in.
Directly. The prophecy says God intervenes dramatically, earthquakes, infighting among the invaders, disease, torrential rain, hailstones, fire, sulfur. It's a divine judgment meant to showcase God's holiness to the nations.
So how are people reading this today, especially connecting it to, say, Russia?
Well, dispensational premillennial views are quite common here. They often identify Gog as a future Russian ruler, Magog as Russia and maybe some former Soviet states. Sometimes the Hebrew word Rosh in Ezekiel 38.2 is linked directly to Russia, though that's linguistically debated.
And the other nations. Persia is Iran, Cush is Ethiopia, Sudan, Put is Libya.
Generally, yes. Meshech and Tubal are often linked to Turkey. Now, the timing is another debate before the tribulation, during the first half, after the tribulation. Some even point to Revelation 20, which talks about Gog and Magog after the millennium, suggesting maybe two different events or a different understanding entirely.
And the Russia-Ukraine war obviously fueled some of this talk.
Absolutely. Seeing Russia as an aggressor fits the Gog profile for some interpreters. But again, the dwelling securely part for Israel is a counter-argument. Plus, the specific nations listed in Ezekiel have, shall we say, varied relationships with Russia and the current conflict. It's not a perfect overlay.
Okay. Now, you also specifically asked us about the India-Pakistan conflict, which flared up again in 2025. Where might that fit, if at all?
That's a tough one because, straight up, there are no direct Bible prophecies naming India or Pakistan. Zero.
So any connections are more interpretive leaps?
More interpretive, yeah. Some look back at those Ezekiel 38 names, Cush and Put, and argue that historically those terms might have covered broader regions, potentially touching on parts of the subcontinent. It depends on how far back you go and which historical maps you use.
Okay. Anything else?
Well, outside of the Bible, there's the Ghazwa-e-Hind concept in some Islamic traditions prophesying a future battle for India. That's separate, but sometimes gets mixed into these discussions.
And within biblical prophecy?
Some point to Revelation 9, describing this massive 200 million strong army coming from east of the Euphrates. Speculation runs wild there. Could it involve Iran, India, China, Russia? Various combinations. It's very general.
And Ezekiel mentions Togarmah from the far north and many peoples. Could that extend eastward?
Possibly. Togarmah is often linked to Turkey, but far north in many peoples could be seen as encompassing a wider area. Then you have prophecies like Zechariah 14 saying all the nations will gather against Jerusalem eventually. That's extremely broad language.
So it really feels like connecting today's specific conflicts like India, Pakistan, or Russia, Ukraine directly to these ancient texts is, well, complicated. Lots of different views.
It is complex, absolutely. And I think it's important to remember the Bible's main focus isn't really to be a coded newspaper headline predictor. It's more about God's overall sovereignty, his plan for salvation and offering hope, even when the world looks chaotic.
Right. So the message, despite warnings of turbulent times, is fundamentally one of hope in God's ultimate victory and for Christians in Christ's return.
Exactly. That's the core theological takeaway, which I think leaves us with a good question to ponder, maybe for you listening.
Yeah.
Considering all these different interpretations, these ancient texts meeting modern conflicts, what does that actually mean for how we live our lives today? How do we find and hold on to hope right now in these circumstances?